I have a good experience talking to some of the people of TNG, and you seem to be people that think through. So I feel like nowadays it's getting more difficult to find engineers that think of themselves and don't just follow hypes. And TNG is not like that, and I like this. So today I'm talk about Wildcard, which is an RPC implementation. And that's the goal of the talk. Talk about RPC, to show what RPC is, what Wildcard is, and the differences between RPC and REST and GraphQL. And hopefully at the end of the talk, you'll be able to know when to use RPC or GraphQL or REST. So what is Wildcard? It's a library to create an API between Node.js and the browser. And it's super simple. You define a JavaScript function on Node.js, and you remotely call it in the browser. That's it. So there's nothing fancy going on there. You defined, can you see this? Yeah. So you define a function in Node.js. Hello world, message, welcome, name. You call it in the browser, and that's it. So what happens in the back is the arguments are serialized into JSON. An HTTP request is made to the Node.js server. The arguments are deserialized. The function here is being called. The returned value is serialized to JSON, replied back to the browser as a HTTP response, and then the browser deserializes it, and you got your return value in the browser. And that's all it does. So you define function in Node.js, you call it remotely in the browser. That's it. So typically you would, in the front-end, back-end environment, you would use this to call the clicker works. You would call SQL or RM queries. So for example here, you create a create to do function, and you use your RM or SQL to actually retrieve data. But that's entirely up to you. What you do in this function, that's nothing to do with Wildcard, that's up to you. You can use any SQL or RM query to retrieve or mutate data. So what we're doing here is called RPC, which stands for Remote Procedure Call. And the idea is very simple. You define a function on a remote process, and you call it in another process in a way that you don't really realize that the procedure that you're being called is run into a remote process. So as we can see here, from the perspective of the browser, this await endpoints hello, this hello function, you don't really realize that it's a function that is being called in Node.js. It's as if the function would be a local procedure. And it's the whole idea of RPC, is you define functions, but you call them remotely as if there would be local procedures. So from the perspective of the browser, of the front end, it's the same as a local procedure. So RPC is actually nothing new. It's super old. It can be dated back as early as the 70s. Then came REST, and we started to use REST, and we kind of forgot about RPC. People were using REST as a default, and they didn't use RPC anymore. But RPC is coming back, and large companies such as Google, Netflix are starting to use RPC again. And even Facebook, who invented GraphQL, is starting to use RPC again. So why is RPC researching? That's going to be the content of the talk. and that's what I'm going to talk about now. So to know why RPC is being used again, I will show the difference between RPC and REST and GraphQL. The fundamental difference between RPC and REST or GraphQL is that RPC is schemaless, whereas REST and GraphQL have a schema. Everything boils down to that. So if you come to the decision, should I use RPC or should I use REST or GraphQL? The question you should ask yourself is, do I need a schema? What's the schema? What's the benefit of a schema? Should I use a schema? Let's look at the difference between schema and schemaless. So on the top, we can see an example with schema. So here we call a CRUD operation on the model to do. And the schema is the idea of the schema is that you have a list of models and CRUD operations on these models. And that's how you work with a API that has a schema. Whereas with schemaless, as we can see here, the same function, you directly call a SQL query or an ORM query. If ORM is your thing, you use an ORM. But if you like a SQL, then you just directly call a SQL query. So you don't go over in the direction of the schema, but you directly use the database queries. Whereas here, the schema abstracts away the database from you. You use CRUD operations on these models of the schema, and that's how you, in this case from the front end, that's how you retrieve and mutate data. Whereas in schemaless, you directly use SQL or ORM queries. So why do we do this in the first place? Why do we use a schema? Why don't we always do the schemaless approach of directly calling SQL or ORM queries? What's the purpose of having a schema? The answer is decoupling. If we go back in this example and we want to change, if we want to change, let's say we want to change the front end and we want to be able to create a to-do item and we want to be able to set it as completed right away. So we would add an argument here, text, and we would add an argument completed, and we would change the SQL query to set the column completed. And here we would just add a completed argument, and that's it. So the important thing here is that to change this, to add this completed, to be able to set a completed flag when you create a to-do, you have to change a function that is defined on Node.js. This means that you have to change your server-side code and you have to redeploy it. So for a little change like this, you have to modify your backend. Whereas in the schema approach, you just usually the CRUD functions on the models of the schema are defined in such a way that you can do all kinds of operations on them without modifying the schema, without modifying the backend. This means that you can develop your front end independently of the backend, without changing the backend and without having to redeploy the backend. Whereas in the schemaless approach, the RPC approach, you much more regularly have the situation where you have to change your backend and redeploy it. So that's the main purpose of the schema, to decouple front end and back end. So decoupling. So what are the benefits of RPC or schemaless? Well, in a way, it's a more direct approach. You don't go over this schema indirection. you skip all that extra abstraction, and you just define functions on the server and do whatever you want on these functions. Conceptually speaking, it's much, much simpler. And it's super easy to use. You define a function in Node.js, and you call it remotely in the front end. It's super easy to use, but more importantly than it to be easy to use, it's much, much simpler. Conceptually, there's nothing going on here. It's conceptually speaking, it's trivial. So that's one big benefit of RPC. It's super simple. And the second benefit is it's powerful. You can use any SQL or ORM query or any server-side tool to retrieve your metadata data. Your Node.js function, you define on the backend, on your Node.js server can do whatever it wants. So you may, one question that you may arise in your head now is like, what about security? You can do everything you want. Shouldn't that be, that sounds dangerous, right? But that's actually not a problem. Let's go back in the ORM example. One important thing to note here is these lines of code. And this is how you do permissions with RPC. If something is going on that is not expected, then you abort your operation. In this case, we only want to create a to-do if the user is logged in. If the user is not logged in, we abort. So we don't run the SQL query. And you can do this for all kinds of permissions. If you want to modify a to-do, and you only want to allow the author of the to-do to be able to modify the to-do item, you check if the author is the same user than if the user that's logged in, if it's the same user than the author of the to-do. If it's the case, then you run the SQL query. If it's not the case, you abort. Yeah, so that's basically you can see permissions with RPC to be done programmatically. So programmatic permissions, so to say. So it's powerful, yet you can define permissions since it's secure. And that's pretty much it. RPC is schemaless. It's simpler, more powerful. REST or GraphQL has a schema. And what it allows you is to decouple, in this case, front-end and back-end. Yeah, that's on the high level, that's exactly the difference between RPC and REST and GraphQL. So let's check some use cases. Let's imagine I'm Facebook. I want to create an API. Should I use RPC or should I use REST or GraphQL? So a third party that uses Facebook's API is developing its application that uses the Facebook API independently of the Facebook API, independently of Facebook's backend, independently of all Facebook's code. And on the other hand, from the other side, Facebook is developing the backend and independently of all the third-party clients that consume the API. So by nature, you have a decoupled situation. And that's why you need a schema. So you cannot develop a Facebook API without a schema. You need the schema. You need to decouple API consumers that can develop the code independently of the API. And as Facebook, you also want to be able to develop your backend independently of all this. Facebook has 200,000 third parties that consume the API. You definitely want to be able to develop your backend independently of these 200,000 third parties. So you need decoupling. And that's why you need a schema, you need REST or GraphQL. So it doesn't come as a surprise that Facebook is using GraphQL and invented GraphQL because there's so many consumers. So they need a schema, and GraphQL is awesome for that, and that's why they're using it. And in general, if you want third parties to be able to access your data, to retrieve or mutate your data, you need a schema, because you don't want to be dependent on these third parties that are using that are consuming your API. What about prototyping? Let's imagine a full stack JavaScript developer, which is developing a prototype. He's doing both front-end and back-end, single developer. Well, by nature, inherently, he develops both back-end and front-end in his head at the same time. You have a coupled situation. You don't really need a decoupling here. From the perspective of a full stack engineer that's doing a prototype, anything else, and using a schema is just an interaction. He's developing the backend. He's writing SQL queries or ORM queries. For him to be able, from the front end, to be able to use SQL or ORM queries is just super nice. He doesn't need a schema. He doesn't need this decoupling. He's doing both at the same time. And that's the key. If you have hand-in-hand front-end and back-end development, then RPC is the way to go. You don't need a decoupling. You don't need a schema. You don't need REST. You don't need GraphQL. And RPC then gives you the full simplicity and power of your server and the full power of your database queries. You can use any database queries you want. What about large teams? That's the gray area. Let's say you have 100 developers doing the front end, 100 developers doing the back end. Do we want RPC or not? Do we want, it's kind of equivalent to asking oneself, do we want decoupling? Do we need a schema? The thing is, when you have that many developers, what typically happens, you have a lot of queries. You have, let's say, tens, if not sometimes hundreds of mobile versions, different versions that are being deployed in the wild that have slightly different queries. And you end up with lots and lots and lots of queries. And this becomes messy with RPC because you have the situation where you have so many clients using your API that a tightly coupling becomes problematic. Because every time you need to change something on one client, then you have to change the backend. So the thing here in large teams is not much the question about how large is this team. It's more about how many queries do you have. If you have lots of queries, RPC becomes unmaintainable. At some point, you do want a stable, long-term contract between your API clients and the API provider. That's how you can see a schema. It's a long-term, stable contract between the API consumer and between the API provider. So it depends. You could have a large teams that have, let's say, only 5 queries between API consumer and API provider, and then RPC would be totally fine. It's not really about the number of people working on this on both sides. It's more about how many queries do you have, how intricate it's going to end up. One solution for this problem is to have deploy RPC as a serverless service. This serverless service is owned and developed by the front end, has access to the database, so this enabling and allowing and giving the full power to the front end team to use any database query they want, any ORM query or SQL query they want. So you can see this service is essentially acting as a thin permission layer between the database of the backend, and the front end. That's one way to go about it. And it's not only either or. You can both use RPC and a schema full approach with the rest of GraphQL. For example, you need third parties that need to be able to access your data. You give them a RESTful API. But for your own clients, you give them the full power of RPC. That's one sensible approach that you can use. Or you could think, well, let's use REST or GraphQL by default. But for the nifty-gritty queries we cannot fulfill with GraphQL or REST, let's use RPC. In general, I would recommend starting first with RPC and seeing how it goes. You start with RPC, and if after a while you realize, okay, I actually need decoupling. This is not going well, and my front end and back end is being intricated, and I need decoupling because my prototype is exploding, and it's getting lots of users, and I'm getting many people on board, and I want to have the backend team working independently of the front-end team. I want to decouple front-end and backend. You can do this progressively. You start with your prototype with RPC, and as you realize you need a schema that decouples, you start to replace queries by queries progressively. You start to replace them with a schema-full approach with a RESTful API or GraphQL API. And that's pretty much it. So that's what I was just saying. Start with RPC, and then as you realize you need a schema, you start to replace it with REST or GraphQL. That's it.